it's 1 o'clock and you're here at the Birmingham Museum. I'm Leslie Pielack, I'm the museum director, and today we're going to do, for our Facebook Live program, we're going to do something more like an artifact short. I wish I could keep it short. The intent was for me to select an artifact out of our collection that I could just talk a little bit about with the audience and kind of give a little context. And so I picked Pewabic tile because we have a couple in our collection and we also have a vase. The intent being I could just give a little bit of background about why Mary Chase Perry Stratton, who founded Pewabic, why she's buried in Greenwood Cemetery. Well, I should have taken a guide from my past experience and known that this was not going to be simple, and it isn't. So today what I want to do is tell you just a little tiny bit about her background and the Pewabic connection with the pottery, but then I want to introduce you to some very irritating and enduring questions about why is she buried in Birmingham's Greenwood Cemetery, and maybe you'll have a good idea or you'll know someone who knows more than we do and you can help us out. Okay, so first about Mary and Pewabic pottery. Mary was one of 3 children born to her father, William Walbridge Perry, who was a doctor, and her mother, Sophia. They lived, at the time she was born, they were up in the Hancock-Houghton area of the Upper Peninsula, which was mining country. And the Pewabic mine was one of the mines. It was a copper mine up there at that time. So this is in the 1870s that they lived there. Mary was actually born in 1867. The family was thrown into chaos in 1877 when Mary was about 10 because her father was killed. He was hit over the head in the middle of the night. It's not clear whether he was the intended victim or it was totally accidental that he was hit instead of someone else. But he suffered a coma for many months, and the family eventually had to move when he died. They came down to the U of M area in Ann Arbor and relocated there. And so we have his widow, Sophia, Mary, who was 10, her sister, who was a teenager, and her brother, who was 18 and ready to go into college. He ended up getting his degree in pharmacy from the U of M. And her mother and her sister, and she lived there with him, and I believe her mother had to work as a housekeeper to try to make enough funds so that he could go to the U of M. So he graduated from there, he got his degree in pharmacy. Meanwhile, Mary, who had quite an artistic ability, was also getting some training in the arts. And her story and her connection to her father is part of what happened in the founding of Pewabic pottery. She used to walk with her father up in the UP on a regular basis before he died, and they would go for walks along the water, which up there are clay deposits that come to the surface. So she would periodically reach down and grab the raw clay and fashion it into figurines and kind of sculpt it and mold it. And that was something she did on her walks with her father. So that is part of the connection to why pottery and why clay. And I think her connection to her father becomes another really important part of this story, because when we were looking at her being buried in Greenwood Cemetery, we also realized that her father is in Greenwood, and her mother is in Greenwood, her sister and her brother, her niece and her niece's ex-husband are buried there. There's this entire cluster of people all connected to Mary and the Perry family. So the question is why? What the heck? Because Mary, after she founded Pewabic Pottery in 1903, she didn't live in Birmingham. She never lived in Birmingham. She married William Buck Stratton, who was an architect of some renown. They lived in Detroit and Grosse Pointe. But each of these people who all lived in adjacent areas ended up in Greenwood. I'm going to come back to that question in a moment, but I thought maybe you'd want to see just a little bit of why Pewabic pottery is so important in this area. So that's the artifact part of today. So over here you see an arrangement of Pewabic related artifacts from our collection. In the front you see a commemorative plate that was actually created by Pewabic in 1983 for the city of Birmingham to commemorate its 50th anniversary as a city. So that's cool. Here is another commemorative tile which was created in 2017 for Birmingham's Senior Men's Club. This is actually not a Pewabic tile, but it is commemorative, and it shows the house in Hancock that Mary and her family lived in when her father died or was killed. And it's in our collection also, so it's another interesting piece. And then in the back is a very beautiful vase. So Pewabic Pottery, which has been in continuous operation since 1903, not only has created tiles, which I think people are most very familiar with, but they make a number of arts and crafts related pieces, this being a vase. Many of them continue to use the molds and styles that Mary herself developed. And certainly the glazes are well known all over the world because they're unique, that Mary developed. This particular vase is not really old. It was donated to us in 2011 by a member of the Stratton family. That is to say, Mary's husband, Buck Stratton. His family, a member of the family gave it to us as a way to remember her and remember Pewabic. And then just real briefly over here, just so you can see some of Pewabic's tiles. These are all vintage tiles that I happen to have at home. I'm sorry, but I collect these odds and ends. These are all vintage Pewabic tiles, some older than others. And you can see they have this really special glazing technique that's used, and that makes Pewabic famous. So back to the Pewabic and connection and Mary Chase Perry's connection to Birmingham. It appears that through her brother getting his pharmacy degree, her widowed mother and her sister, they had different attempts at, it looks like, trying to form marriages with people that just did not work out very well. So her brother Frederick, he married and was moved around from Ann Arbor to Detroit. He opened his own drugstore there, and he was a pharmacist, druggist, somewhat successful from what we can tell. And he got married, he got divorced, he got remarried, and this went back and forth. But through all of that, he was trying to support his mother, and so periodically in the census we can find that his mother lived with him. He was a head of household. She lived with him. Mary lived with him as a single woman, and his sister Gertrude, who was a couple years older than Mary, got married in 1890, but seemed to never live with her husband. She was always Mrs. Gertrude Spencer, but Mr. Spencer was never in the picture, and it isn't clear why, but they were being supported by her brother off and on. And then there's this thing that happens right around 1898. They show up living in Birmingham. We do not know why. I think they were all renting a house together. I think it was in between Frederick, her brother's, one of his marriages, and then there was a divorce, and I think that they were back living with him. Somehow they ended up in Birmingham. He still worked in Detroit, but this is a time when the Detroit United Railway had been laid and was used all the time for people to commute from Birmingham to Detroit. Birmingham was kind of a bedroom community at the time. So it appears as though they lived here and commuted to Detroit, and he commuted to Detroit. Somewhere around that time, he may have become acquainted with the Peabody family and their only daughter, Harriet, or Hattie Peabody. She was actually married and divorced herself as a fairly young woman, just around that same time. So whether they were connected in some way then exactly isn't clear, but that's the first time these people's paths cross, and they cross in Birmingham. Why that matters, relates to the Greenwood question. So Harriet and Frederick did marry, but they didn't marry for another 10 years. And Sophia, his mother, and Mary Chase Perry, and his sister Gertrude apparently may have lived up here for a while, but they were back in Detroit again. So the connection seems to have to do with the Peabodys. In 1909, Frederick married Harriet Peabody. She had been married before and they had a daughter. And they once again lived in Detroit. And at that time it looks like his mother and sisters, again, they were still acting as single women, including Mary Chase Perry. She was, already in her 30s and early 40s, but she had been single the whole time. They moved together and lived down in Detroit again. So they kept moving around. They were always in rental properties. And then in 1910, everything started to shift. Some point after 1910, there were a series of deaths, and with the different people who died, they all were buried in Birmingham. I actually have to go to my cheat sheet because it's just kind of hard for me to keep it all straight. So in 1910, Hattie Peabody and now Frederick Perry lived in Detroit, and Hattie's daughter Grace lived with them. Grace was ill from her childhood and she died in 1912. So she's a Peabody, so it makes sense to me that Grace, who's the grandchild of the Peabodys up in Birmingham, would come to Greenwood to be buried. That makes sense to me. But 2 years later, Gertrude Perry, who has no connection to Birmingham that we know, she dies, and she is buried the next day in Greenwood. Her mother, Sophia, dies a few months after that in 1914, and within 2 days, she is buried in Greenwood. So what's going on here? And Mary Chase Perry, 4 years later, married her husband, her first husband. She was already 51 years old, so she's a functioning adult for a long, long time as a single woman. And then her brother dies in 1919, and he is buried right away in Greenwood. And so eventually in 1938, William Stratton, Mary's husband, he dies, he's buried in Greenwood. They all end up being in Greenwood. And the only connection that seems to hold is that Harriet Peabody, who actually lived until 1943. Yes, she's buried in Greenwood. That they were all felt connected as a family, and it's almost like they were taking care of each other throughout their lives, and they continued to do that as the different members of the family died. And the big question, though, is at some point after 1910, Dr. Perry, who died in Houghton, Hancock, that's Mary Chase Perry's father, he was exhumed and moved to Greenwood. And we don't really have a firm date about that. So we don't know if Mary did it, or if her brother did it, or if it happened sometime, after their deaths or whatever. But if you visit Greenwood Cemetery, you can go to the Perry section of the cemetery, and you can see all these people who are related. Sometimes by marriage, but definitely by love. They seem to all take care of each other and stay as close as possible, even after death. There is a story circulating that probably is, it's unlikely to be accurate, that the reason Mary Chase Perry Stratton is buried in Greenwood is because the Booth family from Cranbrook felt sorry for her because of the Depression and the fact that she had no money. This is the story. And so they gave her a plot for herself and William Stratton. Well, that doesn't really add up. First of all, we don't think that she had any money problems as a result of running a very famous pottery. And the properties or the plots where she's located are not where the Booths are. The Booths have a very large area there. They're not even in the same section. So we think instead it's related to all of these deaths in 1910, and that somehow plots were purchased and kept for the family. And just so that you have a little parting image to go with, here is a photo of Mary Chase Perry as a single woman arranging tiles. You can see she's sort of diminutive and small. So she was a single person running a business and being a very effective artisan for decades before she ever decided to get married to William Buck Stratton. Here's another photo. This is the Detroit Historical Society, I think, has this photo. This is her, and it's dated 1918. It appears to be, to me, a wedding portrait. The whole portrait shows her feet and shows her wearing these very beautiful white satin slippers, and the gown she's wearing is very delicate. This is not what a potter normally wears walking around Pewabic Pottery. So I believe this might have been her wedding portrait. And you can see her age is about right. She's about 51 here. But she still has that very beautiful, calm quality about her. So you now have part of the answer, maybe, and a lot of the questions about the Mary Chase Perry Stratton and why she's buried in Birmingham's Greenwood Cemetery. Now, we will be having cemetery tours this year. The Friends of the Birmingham Museum will be holding the tours. They will take place on Saturday, September 26th at 1 p.m. And if you're interested, it's $10 per person. Please bring an exact amount or a check. And you can show up at the East Gate at 1 o'clock. Social distancing will be followed. And also, we want to announce that tomorrow, Friday, is the first day of our pop-up exhibit. We're going to take our Women's History exhibit outdoors to the plaza between the Allen House and the Hunter House. And we're going to display it along with our National Archives materials that relate to the women's suffrage movement. We'll be doing that every Friday from 1 to 4 in September. So please join us. It's totally free. We are definitely following social distancing, but we're there to answer questions, show you our artifacts, and we'll be talking about the politically empowered women of Birmingham as part of that. We have quite a few to tell you about. So hope to see you tomorrow. Stop by, walk on up, and enjoy our outdoor pop-up exhibit, or give us a call if you have a question or if you know any more about the connection between the Mary Chase Perry Stratton of Pewabic Pottery and Greenwood Cemetery. And if I have been speaking really quickly, it's because I wanted to really get a lot in. So I hope I haven't gone too fast here. But give us a call if you have any questions or further comments. We enjoy doing these pop-ups, and we're doing these artifact shorts. Next week, Facebook Live will be a traditional Facebook Live, I believe. I'm looking over at Donna, who is nodding her head at me. So do we know what next week? Oh, yes. Yeah. Donna and I will be talking about water stories in Birmingham. Boy, do we have some water-related stories. You just have to join us to learn more about it. Thanks and goodbye.